History doesn't always end when the ball lands in the seats. Sometimes the most unforgettable moment happens after the crowd has stopped cheering. After the interviews. After the cameras are turned away. After everyone thinks the story is over. On this night, Dodger Stadium erupted for one of the greatest milestones of Shohei Ohtani's career. Home run number 300. A towering drive that disappeared into the night sky, sending more than 40,000 fans to their feet. Teammates poured out of the dugout. The scoreboard flashed giant golden numbers. The crowd refused to sit down. For nearly 2 full minutes, the applause never stopped. It was the kind of baseball moment children dream about. A milestone that only a handful of players in Major League history have ever reached. The television broadcast replayed the swing from every possible angle. Slow motion. Center field. Behind home plate. The crack of the bat. The effortless follow-through. The ball soaring into the left field seats. Every replay made it look even more unbelievable. Commentators talked about legacy. About history. About how Ohtani continued rewriting what seemed possible for one player. Pitcher. Slugger. MVP. Now a member of the exclusive 300 home run club. The stadium celebrated. Fans celebrated. Baseball celebrated. But while everyone else was looking toward the field, Shohei Ohtani quietly walked the other direction. No dramatic celebration. No long interview. No posing for photographs with the historic bat. Instead, still holding that bat in his hands, he disappeared through the tunnel beneath Dodger Stadium. Most people assumed they knew exactly what was happening. Of course, the Dodgers' memorabilia department would want the bat. It would eventually sit inside a glass display case. Perhaps Cooperstown would ask for it someday. Maybe it would become part of a museum exhibit celebrating one of baseball's greatest two-way players. That seemed obvious. After all, milestone bats don't simply disappear. They're carefully documented. Protected. Stored forever. Even television crews expected Ohtani to hand it directly to team officials. Instead, he kept walking. One hallway. Then another. Past the training room. Past the clubhouse entrance. Past the media interview area. The deeper he walked beneath the stadium, the quieter everything became. The roar from 40,000 fans faded into little more than a distant echo. Only the sound of footsteps remained. If anyone had been following him, they probably would have been confused. Because he wasn't heading toward the memorabilia office. He wasn't looking for reporters. He wasn't searching for executives. He wasn't even going toward his locker. He seemed to have somewhere else in mind. A place almost no television camera ever visits. Behind the clubhouse sat a modest equipment room. Nothing glamorous. No championship banners. No bright lights. No reporters. Just shelves lined with batting helmets. Stacks of towels. Boxes of baseballs. Containers of pine tar. Rows of carefully organized bats waiting for tomorrow's game. Inside that room, an elderly man continued working as if nothing historic had happened. His name was Harold Midmore. Most people simply called him Hal. He had spent decades working around professional baseball. Long before many current players were born. Long before social media turned athletes into global celebrities. Long before Shohei Ohtani ever stepped onto an American baseball field. Hal had already been arriving before sunrise. Leaving long after midnight. Day after day. Season after season. Year after year. His job wasn't glamorous. In fact, most fans would never even notice it existed. Before players arrived each afternoon, Hal made sure every locker looked perfect. He organized batting gloves. Prepared fresh towels. Checked batting helmets. Inspected batting cages. Replaced broken equipment. Lined up bats exactly where players expected to find them. If someone needed pine tar, Hal already had it ready. If a batting glove tore during practice, Hal quietly replaced it before anyone even asked. If rain delayed batting practice, Hal reorganized the equipment schedule without complaining. When players celebrated victories, Hal cleaned the clubhouse afterward. When players suffered heartbreaking defeats, Hal still cleaned the clubhouse afterward, whether the Dodgers won by 10 runs or lost in extra innings. His work never changed. Few people knew his name. Even fewer understood how much he actually did. That was the nature of his job. Invisible. Necessary. Constant. Years earlier, another young clubhouse assistant had once asked Hal why he never complained about working behind the scenes. Hal smiled while folding a stack of clean towels. "Because if people notice me," he had answered softly, "it usually means something has gone wrong." He wasn't looking for attention. He never had been. His greatest compliment was finishing a day without anyone realizing how much work had gone into making everything look effortless. Tonight felt no different. Even after witnessing Ohtani's historic home run on a small television mounted in the corner of the equipment room, Hal returned immediately to work. Bats needed cleaning. Batting gloves needed organizing. Laundry needed sorting. Tomorrow's game would arrive sooner than people realized. Baseball never waits. He was carefully wiping dirt from a batting helmet when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up casually. Shohei Ohtani stood quietly in the doorway, still holding the bat. For just a moment, Hal assumed exactly what everyone else would have assumed. "The memorabilia staff will probably be here in a minute," he said politely. "They'll want that bat." Ohtani smiled. But he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped farther into the room. Hal noticed something unusual. Ohtani wasn't in a hurry. Normally, after games, especially milestone games, players are quickly surrounded by reporters, teammates, public relations staff, and photographers. Not tonight. The hallway outside remained silent. It was just the two of them. One of baseball's biggest superstars, and one of baseball's least recognized workers. Hal chuckled nervously. "I should probably find somebody." "Again?" Ohtani simply smiled. "No," he said quietly. "I'm already with the person I came to see." Hal looked behind himself instinctively. Maybe someone else had entered the room. Nobody had. Only then did he realize. Ohtani meant him. For a second, neither man spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that only exists after a stadium empties. After emotions settle. After history has already happened. Ohtani slowly looked around the room. His eyes passed over shelves filled with equipment. Boxes carefully labeled. Stacks of freshly folded towels. Rows of bats standing perfectly upright. Everything organized with remarkable precision. Finally, he looked back at Hal. "I've noticed something," Ohtani said. Hal smiled politely. "Oh. No matter what time I arrive. You're already here." Hal laughed. "I try. And whenever I leave. You're still working." Hal shrugged. "Somebody has to." Ohtani nodded. For another few seconds, he simply stood there holding the bat. The very bat that had just produced one of the biggest moments of his career. Outside, fans were probably still talking about the home run. Television analysts were likely debating where it ranked among baseball milestones. Social media had almost certainly exploded. But inside this small equipment room, none of that mattered. Ohtani slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a black marker. Hal assumed he was preparing to autograph the bat before handing it over to the memorabilia department. That would make sense. Collectors always value signatures. Carefully, Ohtani removed the cap. He looked down at the smooth wooden barrel. Then, with deliberate strokes, he began writing directly onto it. Not just his name. A message. Hal couldn't see the words from where he stood. He didn't want to interrupt. So he simply watched in silence. Every letter seemed carefully considered. No rushing. No dramatic speech. Just quiet gratitude flowing from marker to wood. When Ohtani finished writing, he capped the marker, looked down at the bat one final time, then slowly turned toward Hal. Neither man realized. The next few seconds would become the moment that neither of them would ever forget. Hal looked at the bat, then back at Shohei Ohtani. There had to be some misunderstanding. Surely Ohtani was about to ask him to store it safely until the team's memorabilia staff arrived. After all, this wasn't just another game bat. This was the bat that had produced career home run number 300. A piece of baseball history. Something that would normally be placed behind glass, photographed from every angle, and eventually displayed for generations of fans. Instead, Ohtani extended it toward him. "Mr. Midmore," he said softly, "this is for you." Hal blinked. "For me?" Ohtani nodded. "Please." For several seconds, Hal didn't move. His hands remained frozen at his sides. He had spent decades handing bats to players. He had cleaned thousands of them. He had organized them before batting practice and collected them after games. But never, not once, had a player handed one back like this. Especially not one connected to a historic milestone. Almost cautiously, Hal reached forward. His hands trembled as he accepted the bat. Only then did he notice the writing across the barrel. In neat black letters, Ohtani had written, "Thank you for making every day possible." Beneath the message sat his signature. Nothing flashy. Nothing elaborate. Just a few words. But to Hal, they carried more meaning than any trophy ever could. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. Ohtani smiled. "You don't have to." Hal shook his head. "This belongs in a museum." Ohtani looked around the equipment room. "Maybe." Then he looked back at Hal. "But before it belongs in a museum, I wanted it to belong to someone who helped make that moment possible." Hal laughed softly through watery eyes. "I didn't hit the home run." "No," Ohtani replied. "But you helped me prepare for every game before I ever stepped into the batter's box." The room fell quiet again. For the first time in years, Hal wasn't thinking about tomorrow's laundry or the next shipment of baseballs. He was thinking about every early morning he'd unlocked the clubhouse. Every late night he'd stayed behind after everyone else had gone home. Every small job no one had ever noticed. Shohei Ohtani had noticed. He hadn't thanked him because he had to. He thanked him because he wanted to. Hal carefully held the bat against his chest, almost afraid to grip it too tightly. "I've always thought of myself as just the guy in the background," he admitted. Ohtani gently shook his head. "Baseball doesn't work without the people in the background." Those words stayed with Hal. Not because they came from one of the greatest players in the world, but because they were spoken with complete sincerity. Ohtani gave a small bow, smiled one last time, and quietly walked toward the clubhouse. He never looked back. Hal remained standing alone in the equipment room, still holding the bat. Outside, fans were celebrating home run number 300. Inside, an elderly clubhouse worker was realizing that after decades of invisible work, someone had finally seen him. The story might have ended there. Historic home run. A quiet gift. An elderly clubhouse worker left speechless. But the moment didn't stay behind the clubhouse walls for long. A few days later, Hal was asked about it during a team interview. He smiled before answering, still sounding as though he couldn't quite believe it had happened. "I've spent most of my life trying not to be noticed," he said. "That's the job. You make sure everything is ready before the players arrive, and when they leave, you clean up so tomorrow starts fresh." He paused, looking down for a moment. "I always thought I was just part of the background." Then he looked up with a smile. "But when I read those words on the bat, I realized Shohei had been paying attention all along." According to Hal, it wasn't the value of the bat that moved him most. It wasn't the milestone. It wasn't even the signature. It was the message. "Thank you for making every day possible." To most people, it was a simple sentence. To Hal, it represented decades of work that had finally been acknowledged. Later that evening, a television analyst reflected on the story. He pointed out that milestone memorabilia usually follows a predictable path. It goes into a display case, a museum, a private collection, somewhere fans can admire it from behind glass. But imagine, the analyst said, being the man who spent 30 years preparing bats for other people, only to have one of baseball's greatest players hand you the most important bat of his career. He smiled before adding, "That tells you everything you need to know about gratitude." The analyst argued that anyone can celebrate a home run. Anyone can admire statistics. But the moments people remember forever are often the quiet ones that happen after the cameras stop rolling. That's where character reveals itself. Shohei Ohtani's career will always be remembered for extraordinary numbers. Home runs, strikeouts, MVP awards, records that may stand for generations. But stories like this remind us that greatness isn't measured only by what happens between the foul lines. It's measured by how you treat the people who helped you get there. The ones whose names never appear on the scoreboard. The ones who arrive before everyone else and leave after everyone else. The invisible people who make baseball possible. Whether this moment ever happened exactly this way doesn't change the lesson behind it. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't keeping history for yourself. Sometimes it's choosing to share it with someone who never expected to be part of it. Because long after people forget where home run number 300 landed, they'll remember the kind of person who decided where the bat belonged.